While finishing up our work in Quillabamba of research there, I received a notice from Lima that North Carolina State University was looking for someone to fill a position as part of their faculty, but to work in Peru with their agricultural development program. They had about 30 people working in Peru at that time under the university auspices. And so I traveled into Lima and met with the North Carolina State people there who had heard of me, the research that I was doing in Quillabamba, and I was offered the position as the sociologist attached to the National Agricultural University there in Lima, La Molina, where I would be a visiting professor. It was to be a 2-year assignment under the university. I'd be a regular faculty member, assistant professor, and at the completion of that tour of duty there in Lima, I would, and the family would be moving to North Carolina State University at Raleigh, North Carolina, to continue working for them in their rural sociology department. And for our kids, after a 9-month vacation in Quillabamba, it was back to school, this time in a private American school located in Lima, which was attended by both Americans and Peruvian. And of course, one of the noteworthy events transpiring in Peru for our family was the birth of William Craig, Will. And not long after, here he is being entertained by his brother David in our backyard in Lima. I'd now like to share with you a very significant event that took place while we lived in Peru. And this has to do with a visit of Spencer W. Kimball, who was a later president of the church, and what transpired during his visit, and several things that happened after his visit. And these are important enough, I think, that you would find them of worth. So I'm going to read to you the visit that, about that visit of President Kimball that I've written in my autobiography. And I subsequently mailed this in, I can't remember who to whom, but it was published, and it's available if you go to Google, just Google it, Wesley Craig, Spencer Kimball, and this account will appear there on the internet. But I'll read this to you at this time. At the time, I was serving as a counselor in the mission presidency of Avril Jesperson there in Peru after we moved to Lima. And while serving with President Jesperson, I had a unique experience involving Spencer W. Kimball, who was then an apostle for the church. This would have been about 1965. 66. Elder Kimball and his wife Camille visited our mission at the tail end of an extensive trip through Latin America. The night before arriving in Peru, they had been up most of the night traveling by car in Chile. The windshield of their car had been broken by a rock from a passing truck, so that during the several remaining hours of driving, they had to wrap blankets around themselves to stay warm from the inrushing cold air. After only a few hours of sleep, they had to catch an early morning flight from Santiago in Chile up to Lima, Peru. Upon their arrival in Lima, the itinerary called for a day-long trip to the Peruvian mountain city of Huancayo, high in the Andes at some 12,000 feet elevation. With no time for them to rest, and at their insistence, the five of us, Elder Kimball, Camille, his wife, President Jesperson, Doris, President Jesperson's wife, and myself, set off in a car. This required traversing the 16,000-foot-high Andes mountain pass, a trip similar to the one I described earlier when our family drove to Cusco. Conversation was animated during the early hours of our trip, but the higher we climbed the steep mountains, the quieter it became. From 10,000 feet on up to the summit, there was virtually silence in the car. It was a draining experience for their Kimballs, who both were in their 70s, as well as for ourselves. And here is a photo that was taken on that trip at the top 16,000 feet elevation at that point in time. By the time we reached Huancayo, there was only an hour left before we were to attend a special meeting at the local chapel, at which Elder Kimball was to speak. As we entered the hotel, I observed how totally exhausted both of the Kimballs were. I remember turning to President Jesperson and remarked that I didn't believe they could possibly be up to attending the meeting scheduled with the local saints that evening. I thought of how disappointing that would prove to be to the local members of the church in Huancayo, who had never had an opportunity of meeting or hearing an apostle of the Lord. About 5 minutes after President Jesperson and I entered our hotel room, there was a knock on the door. It was Elder Kimball, asking if we would join him and Camille in their room for prayer. We all knelt together around their bed, and President Kimball prayed. He pleaded with the Lord for strength to carry out the assignment. Upon concluding the prayer, we returned to our rooms, and at the designated time for leaving for the chapel, both Elder and Sister Kimball were ready and smiling. That night, I heard a powerful, warm, spiritual message given by an apostle of the Lord to the expectant and receptive congregation. There was no hint of the exhaustion that I observed earlier, no indications of the tiring ordeal of his long South American tour and the sleeplessness of the preceding Chilean night, no evidence of the wearing trip we had just been through all that day. I witnessed a man of God being sustained by the Spirit to carry out his assignment. In later years, when the injunction of President Kimball became "lengthen your stride," I understood what was required. In the face of whatever adversity, even in an elderly condition, you just do it with the Lord's help. I just want to mention another incident that took place on that trip up over the Andes and back. During that trip, which was about 66, Brother Kimball asked a question of President Nicolason and myself, and it was to the point that, what do you believe will be the impact of the present position of the church on the Negroes, blacks, with regard to progress of the church in Latin America on the basis of your experiences. Brother Nicolason gave his opinion, and I gave mine, and I related an incident which had taken place on my mission to Uruguay about 10 years, 12 years earlier. As a fairly new member of the church, I'd only been a member of the church about 2 years, 3 years. I was called to sit in on a hearing, a bishop's court. Actually, it was a mission president's court, being held for one of the members of the church there on the issue of his ancestry. At that time, the church had the position that you did not give the priesthood to someone who was of Negroid background. And what had been discovered after the member had been baptized, after he received priesthood, and after he was called, as I recall, to be a branch president, a question arose because of photographs that were observed in his home, which were, when found out, there were his parents, and they were obviously black. So the mission president held the court, the hearing, and in this, the brother acknowledged, yes, those were his parents, yes, they were black. And the outcome of that hearing was that he lost his priesthood and was removed as branch president. That disturbed me. However, being new to the church, it just seemed like, okay, I guess that's what happens. Well, I related that incident to Brother Kimball and added my belief that it would seriously jeopardize missionary work in Latin America, especially in those areas where there was a strong Negroid racial background, Caribbean, Brazil, Argentina, and even in Peru, there had been slaves brought in to work in the haciendas there in Quillabamba at an earlier point in time. Well, I mention that because I'm sure that I was not the only one we were not the only ones being questioned by Brother Kimball with regard to what the impact of that particular belief had on missionary work in Latin America. I'm sure he got the same information from many. But what a joy it was. 1970 and 1978, I recall, to hear that the President Kimball announced that position of the church had changed, and from here on, no one would be excluded from, worthy member would be excluded from receiving the priesthood, regardless of racial background. What a joy to experience that and know that in a small way I'd probably contributed to his gathering of information. This is a photo of Sister Kimball on the left on that trip, Sister Jesperson and Mary Jo. There are two more incidents related to that visit by President Kimball and Sister Kimball that I'd like to relate to you that are significant to me. And one has to do with a visit that we made with the Kimballs to the coastal ruins of Chan Chan, which was part of the Chimu civilization that preceded the Incans, located on the coast near Trujillo. During this visit with them to the ruins of Chan Chan, We were accompanied by a reporter from the largest newspaper in Peru. During that visit, I had the opportunity of talking to the reporter about the beliefs of the Mormon Church, about the Book of Mormon, Joseph Smith, the visit of Christ to the Americas, and he seemed, just moderately interested. However, surprisingly, the week after President Kimball had left, the reporter showed up at our door at our home in Lima and asked if he could spend more time with me talking about what I had told him about the visit of Christ to the Americas. And I said, sure, I'd be happy to. So he came in and we talked for about an hour. And then not long after that, a full-page story appeared in the largest Sunday supplement, the largest newspaper in Peru. Well, the reporter got a few of his facts mixed up. He basically told the story of Joseph Smith, the Book of Mormon, and Christ being in the Americas, and Viracocha as being Jesus Christ. The next morning at my office in the university, a number of the faculty in my department and students who had been teaching came by and asked me if those truly were my beliefs with regard to what was printed in that article. I assured them that yes, it was. And as a sequel to this, I'd like to read to you a short account of what happened in Cusco just before and just after the publication of this article. My friend from Quillabamba, Manuel Concha, at that time was lying sick in the hospital in Cusco, unbeknownst to me. He later informed me that while there he had shared with several other patients his newfound information about the Book of Mormon. They had scoffed at him and his uneducated acceptance of such beliefs. He had felt quite depressed following this incident, with no way to confirm to them the significance of his understanding. And the very next day, the article about Viracocha and the Book of Mormon appeared in the newspaper. Excitedly, he showed this article to his skeptical friends in support of his position. He later told me that it was as if God had answered his prayer. Shortly after we left Peru, missionaries were sent to Quillabamba, and we were told that the first converts in the Quillabamba branch area were the Concha family, Manuel, Marta, and their family.